Now that it's September and the first day of autumn is just weeks away, all the beautiful colors from fall foliage are nearly upon us. And if you're excited as I am about capturing all the brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows on 35mm and 120 film, but not sure which film stock to pick, here's my little guide and shooting experience and a few comparisons. Now, I'm by no means an expert, but I wanted to share my experience of what I've shot to date during the fall. Now, there's two main types of film that we could go with fall colors, color negative or color positive film. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about black and white, although I know there's plenty of film shooters that do black and white to look at the gradations of the leaves and using filters and such, but we're just going to focus on color negative and color positive. I will say I am curious how creative effect films like Lomography purple and turquoise would do in the fall, but I'll save that for another time. So the way this video is going to work is I'm going to give a brief overview of each of the films I've shot and then do some comparisons of the ones I've shot side by side. So to date, I've shot 18 different film stocks for fall colors, 13 of those being color negative, and 5 of them being color positive or slide film. And I've shot them for each of these 4 companies, Fujifilm, Kodak, and Cinestill, 8 on Fujifilm, 8 on Kodak, 1 on Cinestill, and 1 on Lomography. So first I'm going to focus on the color negative films. So first up is Cinestill 400D. This is a newer film that came out in the spring of 2022. And, it's really just based off of a Kodak movie film, but it's been fun to shoot, and here's my photos from fall. As you can see, it actually does a really good job with the leaves. It has beautiful gradation throughout the leaf color. I did capture foliage around as well. You can see the green grass, yellow, and red here. And here you see the little dotted parts of red. I thought it stood out really nicely. Now here's a little bit earlier in the season, and you can see the different colors of yellow, green, and red and orange. So overall, I think Cinestill 400D does a pretty good job of fall colors. Next up is the now defunct Fujicolor Pro 400H. This has been one of my favorite films for portraiture, and it does very well, I think, with greens. So let's see how it does for fall colors. So I only had a couple of photos here for when I shot in fall colors. And to be honest, I think it doesn't do that great of a job because Fuji Pro 400H usually does a very good job with greens. And in this way, it kind of accentuated the greens more and kind of left out, I think, the oranges and reds in here. Next up is another expired or discontinued film, Fujicolor NPS 160. This was technically considered a portrait film, but I shot it a little bit the last couple of years with fall colors and liked how it turned out. So this is actually one of my favorite shots I've gotten for fall colors on film. I love all the different gradations of the leaf. You see some bright reds and oranges, you see some yellows and greens, you see some of the leaves that are actually already like wilted in kind of that brown color. So I really love this shot. There's a couple other shots I have here showing NPS. I think it also did really well with the yellows and the sunlight. I really like this shot a lot. It has this very kind of almost of a nostalgic look to it, I feel like. Now, in a bright sunlight, I think it really helps make the reds pop. So overall, very lovely colors. Here again with some yellows and greens and the sun kind of shining. And here's one where it was a little bit later in the season. You see the reds is orange. You see a little bit of browns too in the trees. So here again, here's kind of an overall view. I think it nicely does all the colors fairly well. Next is another one of the Fuji likes to kill the films, but technically now this film is discontinued. Fujicolor Superia XTRA 400, but it was a great film. So I want to show you some of the shots I took with this. Here's a good example of where you see a lot of different colors here. You see the tree has a lot of orange and red, and then you have a little bit of yellowish brown and green throughout the scene. So I think it handles all 3 colors very well. Here again, you see this shot among the lake. It really, I love how the green parts are kind of peeking out of the orange. It also handles yellows, I think, very nicely. You see the backlit yellow and green leaves here, and I think the yellow really stands out. I think this one's really cool. The tree really glows here, and loved how this one turned out. Here's another shot, and I think it has a good gradation of color throughout the scene. Here's another one with yellows and greens. So again, when thinking about fall colors, you want to think about all the kind of the four main colors. I would say yellow, orange, and red are the main ones you want to go after, but sometimes there's still some green in the scene. Here's kind of how they all look together, and I think it was a lovely film. So here's a couple with Fujicolor Superia XTRA 800. I didn't get to shoot that much with this, so I only have a couple of examples, but just wanted to show what it looked like. So here's at a lake. It was actually kind of like late in the day, a little bit overcast, and a little bit late in the season too. So it just has, it's not as bright and brilliant as the last one, but you see kind of these nice yellows and maroons in the shot. Here's one that's, again, like the colors of the leaves kind of are kind of this bright red, but a little bit maroonish in the colors. Here you can tell it's a little bit past peak, but also I think the film isn't doing it that much help. And then in this example, I think what you see is you can definitely tell there's like yellow, orange, and red, but it doesn't do a good job of kind of differentiating between them. But I still think it looks pretty cool. So here's kind of all four of them side by side. Next up is Kodak Ektar. Thankfully, this film is still being made, but this is definitely one of my favorite landscape films that I shoot a lot of, and I want to show you how it looks in the fall. Almost anyone who shoots Ektar knows that the reds really pop. So if you have scenes with red in it, it's a great one to shoot. And as we know for fall colors, especially at the peak of the season, there's a lot of red. So again, that red is just popping here. Now, sometimes if it's a very bright day, that red can be a little harsh, but you see the red and the orange. It still looks very lovely, and in contrast with the blue of the house and the blue of the sky here, as well as the green. Here's another example where the house is a little red, but the tree is a little bit more yellow, but it still has this very lovely, warm feel, I think, that we all love about fall. Now here, I think is really cool. Like it's a very busy scene, I think, but a little bit with the focus in on the branch and how it rendered the red here. I think it kind of pulls you into that warmth and that fieriness of that color. Here you see a few dotted parts. I think it's fun to show where sometimes the foliage might be more subtle, but I like how the red pops here. Now, this is one of my favorite shots because these leaves kind of were half changed, and I thought this was really cool, but the red really stood out in this shot. These trees were interesting because it was fascinating to me that the reds would come out of the greens and it wouldn't change all uniformly sometimes, making it very dramatic. Now, I know there's no red in the scene, so and I'll actually share this later. You'll see this compared with another film, but you can see there's no red, but there is a lot of warmth still in this scene. So again, here's kind of the overview of everything from Ektar. The reds really pop; they really come out. You see a lot of different colors from the yellows, reds, and oranges and greens, and I think it's a great all-around film for fall colors. Next up is Kodak Gold. Now, I've shot a lot of this film as well, both in 35 and 120, and it's a great film. It's probably one of my favorites, especially since 120 came out. It's one of my favorite kind of go-to all-around film, so let's see how it does for fall. Here's a few shots of just the green and the yellow. So obviously when fall color starts, early in the season, you start to see the yellow first usually, and orange and red soon follow after. Here's kind of the red and the green for this tree. Now, you saw this example actually earlier with the Ektar, and as you can tell, the reds don't pull you in as much. In fact, it feels more kind of orange and yellow that pulls you into the scene more. So here's another example where I think gold really kind of has this very warmish summer afternoon, or, late autumn afternoon feel to it, and I think this does a good job of showing that warmth. Here's a similar example that I showed with Ektar, but a little bit of the dotted reds, but I don't think it's as pronounced as it was on Ektar. So here's another example shot side by side with the Ektar, and you see that red again does not pop in the same way that it did on Ektar. You might have remembered this shot earlier on Ektar too, is you see a lot of yellow and brown in the scene. You don't see any red, and it kind of is as you would see it. So here's again kind of the overview of gold and how it rendered fall colors. Next up, Kodak Portra. Now, I know this is a favorite among a lot of film photographers nowadays, and to be honest, I don't shoot it that much, but I had a few rolls that I shot during the fall, and I wanted to show what these rendered. So here's a lovely shot of, this was very much later in the season. You see lots of oranges, lots of red, and a little bit of yellow and a little bit of green there. And I think it turned out nicely. Here's a little bit of close-ups of the leaves. Now here's some where you see a lot more of the yellows and some greens. So didn't have a lot of examples to share, but overall I think it had some loveliness, especially with the oranges for fall colors. Next up is Portra 800. Now this is actually one I wish I had shot more of. It's definitely my favorite of the Portras. And so I'll show a couple of shots, but I definitely didn't get to capture as much as I should have. So I just have these 3 shots to show. You can kind of see the yellows, the oranges, and the reds here. I would say that it renders the reds very nice, almost like a kind of almost a little bit pinkish on the shot on the left, and then the yellows and oranges have a very nice look in the middle shot. Again, not a lot of example here to share, but a good reference to start. Kodak Pro Image is a fun one to shoot. I think it's kind of like undervalued or underappreciated in the film community, but I like this one. So let's check out how it does in the fall. So here's a couple of nice shots. I love this close-up of the leaf. You have a little bit of the orange forming in there with some yellow and green. Now here, this was actually a bit more yellow than what you see here, but it's kind of rendering a lot more green. And then you can see that the kind of the orange and red are kind of almost like a brownish color in this shot. So here's some more yellow and green. A little bit of orange. I don't have a lot of examples here, and from what you can see for the most part of what I had, definitely leaned more yellow, and it didn't really pull out the oranges and reds much. Definitely something you can test out more, but I think this is a little bit similar to gold, and maybe even a mixture of like gold and Portra 160, where the kind of red and orange doesn't pop as much as the yellow. Now, I shot a little bit of this Kodak Vision3. This was through the film photography project, actually, but it's just Kodak film, movie film put into, still photography. It does still have the ECN too, so I had to go send it off to get that processed. So I just have a couple of shots here. I think it rendered very, it kind of blew things out for what I saw of the film. I don't have a lot of examples, so it's definitely something I could test more. I do have a few more examples of the Kodak Vision3 250D rather than the 50D, so let me show you those ones. So I like this shot. It's similar to that shot earlier on the Fuji NPS 160, but you can tell it basically, it looks kind of overexposed. So either I got the metering wrong, or it loves the light and it likes to pull it all out. So you can see here in a couple of these shots that it really seems to pull out the yellows and oranges a little bit. And I like this shot of the close-up of the leaves and how they're slowly turning into the orange. Here's some red here in this shot, and I thought this turned out pretty nice. This one was kind of actually close to past peak, so not as much the film's fault, but it is definitely pushing it towards the brown side more than the yellow side. Again, kind of overexposed, but really kind of pushing that light. Overall, I think The yellows kind of turned out nice, a little bit of the greens, but didn't really turn out as nice on the reds and the oranges here. Now, Lomography Color 400, this is a fun one, and I kind of wish I had shot more of this, but I love this film. I think it's the colors turn out so nicely, and I've taken it with me on many trips, and I love how it looks. So I'll show you how it did for a roll for fall. So I know this is a little underexposed, you can tell, but I love how the oranges, the reddish oranges of the tree turned out. It looks just so, it almost looks like a flower to me. It has this really cool, like blooming look to it. Here again are a couple of trees. The left side especially has the reddish orange. It just has a liveliness to it that I really like. Now here's some foliage here. You kind of have the mix of the yellows, greens, and reds. It looks pretty good in this scene. And then here, I love the looks of all the leaves on the ground as well as the leaves above of the yellows and the greens. I especially like the yellows in this shot. Now this shot I love a lot. I think all the various colors is in the scene, the oranges and the green popping through, it just turned out so lovely. So here's all of them kind of showing side by side. I think this could be a really good chance to test out this film more for fall. So next I'm going to talk about color positive films. Obviously we did a lot with color negative, but you'll get to see some good stuff with some slide film. I mean, that when you see it on the light table, your fall color photos on a light table in the slides, it just looks so beautiful, so magical. So let's get into it. So the first one I'm going to show is another example of a Fujifilm that is discontinued, no longer in existence, but I am also a digital shooter, and so on my Fujifilm digital camera, Astia is by far my favorite film simulation actually to shoot. So here's how that did for fall colors. You saw this shot earlier on NPS, and I just, again, love how the colors look here. Has this very nostalgic look, but I think it renders the yellows very well. Here's some of the fall foliage. Here you see all the lovely yellows in the leaves. Now, I think the reds look nice in the shot, but I think it's a little bit blown out. But I think contrasted against the blue of the sky, it looks very nice. Here, the oranges didn't seem to render as well, and the oranges and reds, but I think it still looks nice against the blue sky. Now, again, the yellows here, yellows and oranges in this one, I think looked a lot nicer. And kind of all side by side, yeah, I think you can see that the yellows, a little bit of the oranges pop. Although that first shot, you see the reds kind of really have this warm glow to them. All right, so Fujichrome Provia is an interesting slide film. I think it's the most, like, I would say, kind of comes out how you see it naturally. I didn't shoot that much with it, so I have very few examples, but I will say this is probably a good one to shoot for fall. So I just have a couple of shots here. It was really cool. We're up in Duluth, and there's still some fall colors, but there was all this snow. So it had this really lovely look contrasting, but I think the Provia handled the orange of the leaves very beautifully here. So next up is one of the classic films of Velvia 50. It's well known for being very saturated. So let's take a look and see how it does for fall colors. So here's a shot I really like. It has this, like, the trees, the orange part is almost like on fire or something like that. It has this really cool look. I love this shot. I think it really shows how beautiful the saturation of the reddish oranges looks so lovely in contrast with the greens here. Here's an example where I feel like there's a lot of color and saturation going on, and it might be a little bit more distracting in this scene, although the red does kind of pop or stand out a little bit. But just something to keep in mind that sometimes having a lot of saturation, it might have your eye wander a little bit. And I would say the only kind of downside, or the downside in general with slide film, but especially with Velvia, is that the dynamic range is very low. So you have to be considerate of your shadows. And so if there's a wide dynamic scene, you have to you want to protect your highlights so you're not getting blown out, but you also don't want to have too many shadows either. So I really like this scene. And this is another example again, though, is needing to meter the scene so I didn't get any too much highlights, because you can see in the background that there's some light on the road there, but the leaves above look very lovely. I think you see all 4 colors. You see the yellow, the orange, the green, and the red. The branches or the tree trunks are a little bit too dark, I think, in this scene, but that's something you kind of have to sacrifice and give and understand sometimes with Velvia. So here's all of them kind of side by side. Again, the saturation and the color popping looks fantastic, I think, for fall colors. All right, on to Velvia 100, which is defunct. But in its time, I got to shoot a little bit for fall, and I'm going to be honest, it didn't turn out that great, but this was one of the first slide films I've shot over the last 5 years, so there might be a little bit of user error in here, but I'll show it to you regardless. So as you can see, it looks a little blown out here, but it's interesting. The reds have this kind of almost like cherry red look to them, especially on the tree on the right. You can tell this is overexposed, but there's still a little bit of loveliness to some of the reds and oranges in this scene. I do like this shot a lot. I think the birch contrasting with the yellow leaves has a very nice look. And in this example, I think the oranges and yellows look very nice, but a little bit more subtle, I think, than 50 did. So again, here's all the various pictures. I think the yellows look really nice and the oranges. The reds sometimes look nice, but other times they were kind of blown out. All right, Ektachrome. So this is Kodak's only existing slide film right now. So Kodak Ektachrome has come back, and I've used it a lot. I think the thing with Ektachrome is that it is really accentuates the blues a lot. So let's see how it does for fall colors, which is not that color. So you can see a little bit here, the fall foliage. You can tell a little bit in the birch, it has a little bit more of a cool cast to it. Here you can see all the various different colors of the green, yellow, and red. And similar to that Velvia, you can tell that there's a little bit more dynamic range than the Velvia, but it's slide film and you have to be mindful. This scene is really nice. We looked at it for Velvia. You can tell there's more dynamic range here. You can actually see the trunks of the trees a little bit better. They're still like a little bit in the shadows, but you can actually make out a little bit on the left 2 trees there, a little bit of the bark. This one was underexposed, you can tell, but I think the oranges and reds turned out pretty nice here. Now here's all of them kind of all side by side together. So now I want to give a few film comparisons. I'm going to show a few of the films side by side just to see how they looked. So first up, I want to show Fujifilm, the NPS versus Astia, which both of them, unless you go on eBay, you can't buy them new anymore. So the top is Astia, the bottom is NPS, and I was actually so surprised how close these two look. It was almost like, Astia was the color positive slide film and NPS was a color negative, and they looked nearly identical to me. So if these two actually were still in existence, I'd probably lean towards the NPS just because, color negative tends to be easier, a little bit more dynamic range to shoot. So next are some of my 2 most shot films, and I wanted to see how these two looked side by side. So here I think is a very good example. We saw some of the Kodak and Ektar in earlier, but here they look side by side in showing you how much the reds really pop in the Ektar. The first 2 shots, especially above, you can see there's a lot of popping of red versus it's much more muted in the gold. I want you to pay attention to the last 2, the ones all the way on the right, and you can see how that field, even though there's no reds in the scene, that field has a little bit more of almost like a reddish brownish hue or tint versus the gold was kind of all yellow, brown, and green. So definitely within the base of the film, you can see the major difference between Gold and Ektar. So here's another example that we saw earlier of how Ektar really pops those reds. I think the first and second image, but especially the second, you can really see the red stands out versus the one on the bottom right. It's you see all the colors together versus one standing out versus the other. So now let's look at the two slide films that are probably the most popular to use for fall colors. So as you can see, and what we've talked about before, is that the Velvia on top is, you can see, just look at the birch trees, that there's a little bit more warmth within the birch on the Velvia versus the Ektachrome. And then going to the middle shot, you see, like we talked about before, is that basically the tree trunks are completely too dark that you can't see any bark, versus the Ektachrome has a little bit more dynamic range. And I think that's especially apparent in the last shot. You see that there's just a little bit more dynamic range. You can see a little bit more of the leaves versus they're a little bit more in the shadows in Velvia. I was actually very shocked and surprised to see how similar these two films actually looked for the most part, other than the fact that Ektachrome does lean a little bit more blue, as I talked about before, and Velvia would lean a little bit more, I guess, red, magenta, kind of more in that area. But overall, the looks of these two films are actually much more similar than they are different, I think. So all that to say, which film is best for fall colors? Well, I showed that all to you because I wanted to show all these different examples. Obviously, not everything was shot side by side, but you could see all these different examples of film and how they render the colors. But before I answer this question, we have to think about one more thing. You have to think about what time of year it is and where you are at in the fall color season. If you're in that early stages, we're still kind of greenish and starting to lean into yellow, versus when it's starting to get to orange versus the reds, or past peak. So there's really kind of those 5 stages of fall that you have to think about. So of the 18 films that I just shared, I'm going to give like some kind of ranking of what I think are the best for different types of seasons. So the top one, I would say, what is the best all around that can handle kind of all 4 colors of the fall season? I think the first one is going to be Ektar. I know it definitely makes the reds pop, but I think if you were to choose one film to go out and shoot for fall, I would recommend Ektar first. But I would say a close second, especially if you like color positive film, I'd say Velvia. I think Velvia really popped all around. It had such beautiful colors when you saw all 4 of them together. So it just really saturates and accentuates fall colors, which is what you want. I would say from an expired film perspective, I really loved NPS. The gradations and tones, and for all 4 colors, I think turned out really beautifully. And if you ever get your hands on this film, I would definitely try shooting it in the fall. And then if you want to go a little bit cooler cast, but very similar to Velvia, I think Ektachrome 100 isn't a bad option either. Next up, if we're thinking about where it's mostly just like your reds and maybe some oranges, again, I have to go with Ektar. It's going to be popping. It's the one to go with first, but there are other options. I definitely loved Lomo 400. I thought it did a beautiful job in some of the examples we talked about, and I definitely am going to plan on shooting more this fall. I think a little bit of a surprise example is actually going to be Cinestill 400D. While it didn't pop as much as the other ones, I think it had a very lovely tone that was a little bit more subtle, but still had some good color saturation, if that makes sense. If it's a little bit more early in the season, but not as much green left, here's my recommendations. First, I would say if you can get your hands on it, Superia Extra 400. I thought it did so well with the oranges and yellows. I think this is a fantastic film to shoot in kind of the beginning to mid time of the season. Next, then, I would say is Portra 400. Again, I think it did those tones very well and is not a bad option to go. And then last in this category, I would say Provia is a very good option. It really rendered those oranges well, and it does the colors kind of as they look while not being as saturated as the Velvia. Now, if you're just at the beginning of the season, first I would say is gold. While I really don't think gold is actually a good option to do most of the fall season, I would definitely lean towards these other ones I recommended. But early in the season, when there's still some green, a lot of yellow, maybe a little bit of orange, but once it gets into the red, I think there's better options out there. Next, I would say if you could get your hands on it, I think at the early part of the season, Astia did a very good job of especially the yellows and some of the oranges. So I guess it'd be kind of, I would say between the beginning and a little bit later in the season, Astia was a really good one. So thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for watching the whole thing. I hope you found this useful. Hope you found it helpful. I hope you go out there and shoot. Please leave in the comments like what was your favorite one that I shared, or just share what is your favorite one that you've shot. I would love to see and hear about your experiences with shooting film for fall.